Chapter 3, Friday 7 a.m. Jeffrey was startled half to death again by the blaring of the alarm clock. The sound was muted by the first punch. Reynolds lifted the pillow off his head and pushed himself up. He swung his legs onto the cold floor, leaned his elbows on his knees, and rubbed his face with both hands. His mouth felt dry, though not as dry as the previous morning. He thought he should try to skip the evening beers sometime. But not yet. He pulled himself to his feet and straightened his back. There was a slight twinge in his lower back. Maybe he shouldn't sleep on his stomach, Jeffrey thought, as he carefully twisted his torso from side to side. Reynolds went to his minimally equipped kitchen, filled a pot halfway with water, and set it on the stove to heat up. He had forgotten to prepare his lunch the previous day. While waiting for the water to boil, Reynolds turned on the TV and listened to the news. Nothing interesting this morning either. He went to empty his bladder and this time brushed his teeth too. The water in the pot had started to boil and Jeffrey added 3 eggs. He checked the time on his phone. In 10 minutes, the eggs would be hard-boiled. Steve would surely have something to say about this too. Always hard or something like that. Reynolds heard Steve's voice in his head and could imagine his lewd grin. After 10 minutes, the eggs got a quick cold bath and ended up in a clear plastic bag. Jeffrey left the apartment and hurried to his car. Making lunch hadn't been part of the original morning schedule, but the boiled eggs were part of his daily meal routine. Steve had made some comment about daily egg consumption. Jeffrey couldn't remember exactly how Steve had phrased it, but it had been something lewd. Jeffrey slipped behind the wheel. Another twinge in his lower back. Now was not the time for that, Reynolds scolded his back. He started the car and turned on the radio. The speakers began to blast Michael Cimbello's Maniac, an 80s hit that never failed to put Jeffrey in a good mood. It did this time as well. Reynolds turned the car around and headed towards his company. By noon, Reynolds had completed his day's work and backed the truck into the office parking lot. Today, he would take the next step. Jeffrey locked the truck and looked at his reflection in the Sierra's side window. Worn blue sweatpants and an oversized black and red plaid flannel shirt. The outfit didn't exude credibility or authority. Maybe he should wear the trench coat. It was still on the Sierra's front seat. Jeffrey opened the door and lifted the coat in front of him. Seeing the coat reminded him of the teenagers who had taunted him at the library. A flasher, huh? Bikers probably wouldn't react well to an uninvited guest, especially one who looked like a flasher. Jeffrey threw the coat back onto the passenger seat. How to make the best first impression? Maybe he should bring beer as a goodwill gesture. Yeah, that should work. Those guys wouldn't turn down a drink. Reynolds decided to go shopping before approaching the gang members. He jumped into his Sierra and headed out. The route conveniently passed by the biker hangout. Today, the chain-link gate was open. Jeffrey slowed down. In the yard, 2 tattooed men in black leather vests sat on their motorcycles, laughing and chatting with a scrawny-looking man leaning in the doorway. Were those Harleys or Triumphs? Reynolds couldn't tell. Or he could recognize the brands when he saw them, but not from a moving car. His own experiences with two-wheelers were limited to his teenage years. Back then, he had a 50cc red Honda Monkey. Once he got his driver's license at 18, he stuck to four-wheelers. One of the motorcycles in the yard had a long front fork, probably 4 feet, Jeffrey estimated. The tank was painted with a skull surrounded by green flames. The flamin' skull theme continued on the fenders. The man sitting on the motorcycle was a hulking mass of muscle. Even sitting down, he was nearly as tall as the scrawny guy in the doorway. The other motorcycle was matte black with a shorter front end. The rider had a shovel-shaped beard and an open helmet in the same dull black as the bike. Long leather tassels hung from the handlebars. On the backs of their leather vests was a picture of a skunk with crossed-out eyes and tire tracks over its back. Above the picture, MC Roadkill curved from left to right. Below the dead skunk it read Finland. The bikers paid no attention to the passing Sierra, even though its broken exhaust made a loud noise. Seeing activity at the biker hangout, Reynolds headed towards the army shop. He could get more appropriate clothing for the evening's meeting there. The idea for the outfit came from the movie Falling Down. In it, William Foster visits a surplus store and ends up fighting with the crazy owner, who eventually gets what he deserves. When Foster leaves the store, his tie and white shirt have been replaced by a thin, army green field jacket. The change in his appearance is significant, and Jeffrey hoped to achieve a similar effect. Hopefully, the army shop's clerk wasn't as crazy as the one in the movie. Jeffrey thought as he parked the Sierra in one of the few spots in front of the store. The shop was located on the ground floor of an old brick building. The facade was painted in a camo pattern, a mix of green and brown in a random jumble. Reynolds noted that the camouflage was remarkably poor at blending into the urban environment. He stepped inside through the reinforced door. The door's entry sensor was connected to a sound system that played a yell from some war movie, incoming. This time, it didn't warn of an approaching projectile, but of a customer arriving. The store smelled of a musty mix of sweat, tar, and some kind of chemical. The low ceiling was entirely hidden behind camouflage nets. The fluorescent light filtered through the holes in the netting, casting spots of light on the store's merchandise. Reynolds wrinkled his nose. The smell was strong and suffocating. Even his smoke-dulled sense of smell wasn't immune to the stench invading his nostrils. The clerk, leaning against the counter, nodded in greeting. Reynolds nodded back, relieved to see that the clerk didn't resemble the crazed Nazi from the movie at all. The army shop clerk was stocky and had thick, yellowish-brown, coffee-stained mustaches. A short-brimmed camouflage cap clung to the back of his head, defying gravity. His clothing matched most of the store's inventory, camouflage. Reynolds surveyed the wide selection in front of him. He noticed the clearance items sign and headed straight for it. In the waist-high, chrome-plated metal bins, he found jackets and pants. Reynolds searched for pants in his size, but realized he didn't know the right size. Some had numbers, some had letters. There were centimeter and inch sizes. Some pants had mysterious C&D markings. Jeffrey couldn't figure out what they meant. Someone had always bought his clothes for him. First his mother, then his now ex-wife. I haven't bought new clothes since the divorce, Reynolds realized. Except for that trench coat, but that was a one-off item, and he hadn't checked the size. Jeffrey picked up jackets and pants from the bins. He could try on the jacket right there, but pants would be more comfortable to try on in a fitting room, especially since he wasn't sure how tattered the underwear he was currently wearing was. He looked around and spotted the fitting rooms at the back of the store. Reynolds grabbed a few pairs of pants and a couple of jackets from the bins and headed for the fitting rooms. In the aisle leading to the fitting rooms, two men were standing. One was a hefty, bearded man, and the other had glasses and long hair. Reynolds stopped, waiting for them to make room. The bearded man pulled out a jacket and asked the other, "How about this one?" "I don't know. Do we even need camouflage for fishing?" The glasses-wearing man pondered. "Maybe not, but it looks damn good." "Yeah, but do you think they have these in black?" Reynolds cleared his throat. He didn't have the patience to wait for the men to realize they needed to move. The bearded man and the guy with glasses fell silent and turned to look at the throat clearer. "Excuse me," Reynolds said and squeezed past them. He heard the men resume their conversation behind him. "I don't even like fishing. You have to handle those damn worms. They're like tiny snakes. Gross as hell," the glasses-wearing man ranted. The bearded man burst out laughing. The laughter was wheezy and uncontrollable. Hearing the whistling breath, Reynolds thought he should cut down on smoking. Finally, the bearded man stopped laughing. He leaned on a shelf with one hand and wiped his watery eyes with the other. "Damn, I might wet myself if you keep making jokes like that." I was dead serious. They have a similar nervous system to snakes. How about we just go for a beer? The glasses-wearing man suggested. Jeffrey didn't hear the bearded man's response. He stepped into the makeshift fitting room, fashioned from particle board and painted white, and pulled the curtain shut. Of course, The curtain was camouflage patterned. The track pants dropped to the floor. The new, stiff camouflage cargo pants felt rough against his legs. The zipper only went halfway up. There was no hope of fastening the button. Reynolds struggled to get the pants back down. The clerk at the register listened with amusement to the grunting and cursing coming from the fitting room. The next size up barely fit when he sucked his stomach in. Reynolds also tried on a jacket. The first one was so big it could have covered the Sierra. Jeffrey checked the size, 4XL. No way. If you need a jacket that big, you should see a doctor. This isn't blending into the forest. The forest would blend into the man. He switched to a smaller jacket and examined himself in the mirror. Reynolds sucked in his stomach as much as he could and straightened his back. Not bad, Reynolds concluded. He changed back into his own clothes and left the fitting room. The fishermen were gone from the aisle. On the way to the register, Reynolds swapped the pants for the next size up. Closer to the counter, Jeffrey noticed the clerk's flushed, flaky cheeks and the yellowish stain on the tips of his right hand, index, and middle fingers from nicotine. The smell of sweat intensified, and it was easy for Reynolds to identify the source of the stench. Jeffrey dumped his purchases on the counter. These, please. Okay. Do you have a loyalty card? Nope. What's the benefit? If you register as a loyalty customer, you get a free cap. The clerk lifted a camo-patterned cap from the pile of Reynolds' purchases. You just give me your phone number and I'll link it to this card. Then you fill in the rest of the details online at home. Reynolds inspected the cap. It had Army Shop written in bold letters. A free cap was tempting, but he doubted he'd use a loyalty card. First a library card, and now this. Soon his wallet would be full of cards. I'll pass this time, Reynolds said reluctantly. No problem. I have to ask. It's protocol. That'll be exactly 30 euros, the clerk said after checking the price tags. Reynolds pulled the money from his wallet. Every bit spent reduced his funds for the gun purchase. As he handed the money to the clerk, Reynolds' hand stopped halfway. There was a cardboard box on the floor behind the counter. Trash was written on the side with black marker. The box was full of combat boots. What's with those? Reynolds pointed with the bills toward the box. Oh, those. They're all broken. Soles are coming off and other minor issues. Combat boots would complete the outfit, Reynolds thought. Got any in my size? The clerk shrugged and bent down to lift the box. The waistband of his pants, held up by suspenders, exposed his plumber's crack. The clerk grunted as he placed the box on the counter for Reynolds to inspect. Go ahead and check. Take as many as you want. They're going to the trash anyway. Reynolds handed the bills to the clerk and began examining the box of boots. At least Reynolds knew his shoe size. 44, like the Magnum. He found a right boot in his size. The sole was peeling off a bit at the toe, but it didn't matter since the price was right. He couldn't find a matching size for the left foot. The largest left boot he found was a 43. It would have to do. Reynolds placed the boots on top of the folded jacket and pants the clerk had prepared and lifted the entire pile into his arms. He thanked the clerk and headed for the door. Wait a sec, the clerk called out. Reynolds turned around. Take this. On the house. The clerk tossed the loyalty cap onto Jeffrey's pile. Thanks, Reynolds said, surprised. He stood there for a moment, taken aback by the friendly gesture. Thanks a lot, Jeffrey repeated and left the store. Inspired by his new camouflage outfit, Jeffrey made a quick stop at the nearby store, purchasing a can of pea soup and a tube of mustard. He also picked up a case of 24 beers, the cheapest store brand. This would serve as a gift and a gesture of goodwill at the biker garage. At home, Reynolds spooned steaming pea soup with mustard directly from the pot while watching shopping TV. He hadn't intentionally chosen shopping TV. He just pressed a button on the remote, and that's what came on. They were selling yet another kitchen miracle device that revolutionized cooking, and to justify the high price, the voiceover promised a second device for free. But wait, there's more, Jeffrey said, switching off the TV. He continued eating the pea soup, contemplating possible scenarios for the upcoming evening. The more he thought about it, the less likely success seemed. He might not even be allowed in, or if he was, he might not have enough money. If they even had a weapon to sell. Was it foolish to assume that this particular gang was involved in illegal activities? No, it wasn't foolish, Reynolds concluded. He had heard enough rumors about this group's activities. There would be weapons. It was just a matter of whether he could acquire one. At 5 o'clock, Reynolds began to put on his newly acquired camouflage outfit. The left boot squeezed his toes painfully. He tried wiggling his toes, but it didn't help. Jeffrey took the boot off and removed the insole. Another fitting. The improvement was minimal but noticeable. The other boot, however, felt fine. He tucked the pant legs into the high boot tops and tightened the laces. The pants billowed above the boots, reminiscent of breeches. He examined his appearance in the hallway mirror. The outfit gave Jeffrey a hint of credibility, but didn't look as good as he'd imagined. The cap looked far too small, so he tossed it onto the hat shelf. He should have bought a beret. Well, it was too late now. In any case, the outfit would have to do. Reynolds checked his wallet and saw he had barely $300 left. He slipped the wallet into his inside pocket, grabbed the beer case, and opened the door. He peeked outside to see if any neighbors were around. One was just walking back from the trash bin, whistling. Damn nosy Parker, Jeffrey thought, recognizing the chubby man. He waited for the man to go inside, scanned the surroundings once more, and then jogged to his car. On the way to the firm, Jeffrey decided to swing by the biker garage. He wanted to check out the situation. As he drove past, he noted that the party was already underway. Thumping music emanated from the building, and about a dozen motorcycles were parked outside. A fire blazed in a barrel, fueled by chopped-up pallets. A few bikers swayed around the barrel, bottles in hand. At 5:30, Reynolds reversed his Sierra next to a truck. He remained seated, hands resting on the steering wheel, trying to calm himself. He hadn't anticipated being this nervous. Finally, Jeffrey turned off the engine and unbuckled his seatbelt. A long exhale emptied his lungs but didn't ease the tension. His heart seemed to be pumping harder than usual. Reynolds glanced at the beer case on the passenger seat. He tore open the case and grabbed a can. The can popped open. Reynolds drank greedily until the can was empty. The can clattered into the passenger footwell. A loud burp filled the car, though it felt like half the burp got stuck somewhere around his sternum. Jeffrey tried to help it along by thumping his chest a couple of times. Soon it came up, but with it came foam, causing a coughing fit. Reynolds coughed with tears in his eyes for at least half a minute before settling down. He wiped his damp eyes with the back of his hands and took another beer from the case. The first one hits the gums, Steve always said. Or was it absorbs into the gums? Reynolds wondered. He wasn't sure what Steve had meant. Well, this one was heading for the lungs. He opened the second beer, but this time took only a sip. Reynolds opened the door, grabbed the case from the passenger seat, and got out. Beer in one hand and the case in the other, he walked toward the biker garage. It would take about 5 minutes. From halfway there, Reynolds could hear the thumping music from the garage. As he got closer, he recognized the song. It was Motorhead's Ace of Spades. Lemmy was growling lyrics filled with gambling references in his 5-note vocal range. Jeffrey wondered if this too was a gamble, some kind of Russian roulette, going to ask for weapons from a criminal gang. Reynolds was at the gates when the song changed to Hurricane's Roadrunner. He hesitated to step inside the gates. 2 bikers in leather vests were still standing by the burning barrel in the yard. They were smoking and chatting. One burst into loud laughter, his head thrown back as if to help the laughter out. The man who had told the joke was shaking with an iconic Jack Daniels bottle in hand. Reynolds drank the rest of his beer and tossed the can behind him. He set the beer case on the ground, took out his cigarettes, and lit one. A couple of beers hadn't yet eased his nerves. Maybe a smoke would help. Cigarette in mouth, Reynolds approached the door. The men outside merely glanced at him and continued their loud, drunken conversation. Reynolds paused at the open doorway. Thick cigarette smoke swirled in the space, which was divided into 2 parts. Amidst the smoke and alcohol, The scent of gasoline and motor oil stood out. The larger part was dedicated to motorcycle maintenance and building. Its brick walls were painted white. At the far end was a table with a stereo system blaring hurricanes through large speakers. A blue pegboard full of neatly arranged tools hung on the wall. In the center of the floor were two motorcycles under repair. One was missing a front fork, and the other had an empty space where the engine should have been. On the right was a door with toilet spray painted in black. The space was divided by a bar that looked just like one in any regular pub. Shelves were stocked with various liquor bottles: whiskey, rum, vodka, cognac. A mirror behind the bar doubled the already impressive collection. Someone was tending bar behind the counter. In front of it were about half a dozen bar stools, two of which were occupied by bald men in jeans and leather vests. The bald men looked so identical that Reynolds wondered for a moment if he was seeing double. The walls on this side were painted black. The wall with the black painted windows had a couple of shabby sofas, one black, the other possibly white at some point. Low, dark wooden tables with ashtrays sat in front of the sofas. Against the back wall was a high-backed armchair occupied by a large man, the same one Reynolds had seen earlier on the long forked motorcycle. The man was nearly 7 feet tall and must have weighed at least 290 pounds, probably more. The man's right temple sported a tribal tattoo, the same as boxing legend Mike Tyson's. Reynolds was pretty sure it was exactly the same pattern. The man's neck and arms were also covered in tattoos. His presence reminded Reynolds of a gorilla guarding its troop from a throne. "The soldier boy seems to have lost his way," taunted the giant sitting in the large armchair. The man's voice was deep, fitting his image, operating just a bit higher in frequency than rumbling bass line in the background. Reynolds lifted the beer case into view. "I heard some noise and came to see if the party was as good as the music suggests." Hurricanes was just beginning the last chorus of Roadrunner. The giant man stared amusedly at Reynolds for a moment. "You've got some balls, showing up like that." "I've got balls. Yeah, but I can leave if my company isn't welcome," Reynolds said, already starting to turn back. "Wait a minute, soldier boy. Throw the beers on the counter and you'll get a proper drink. Timothy, make the soldier boy a VIP drink," the giant instructed the bartender, who immediately grabbed a glass from the shelf and began preparing the drink. Reynolds went to the counter and placed the beers in front of him. The bartender took the beer case and handed Reynolds a drink in a thick-bottomed, low glass. Jeffrey raised the glass to eye level and inspected the drink. The liquid was reddish and looked thick. Reynolds downed the drink in one gulp and regretted it seconds later. The drink burned his mouth and throat, the burn intensifying with every moment. What the hell kind of poison was this? Reynolds wondered as the burning spread. He grimaced and drew air through his teeth. This was clearly a special drink designed for unwelcome guests, Jeffrey thought. The burn was now felt in his stomach. The bartender opened one of Reynolds's beers and handed it to him, which he grabbed immediately and drank eagerly. Reynolds felt his face heating up and sweat beads forming at his receding hairline. The beer didn't seem to alleviate the burn, at least not by cooling it. Jeffrey blew out air, trying unsuccessfully to cool his burning mouth. He noticed a bag labeled Super Chili Powder on the lower shelf of the bar. Jeffrey started coughing and remembered that buttermilk helped with the burn. Would a White Russian help? His eyes watered, and clear mucus began to seep from his nose. Reynolds wiped his running nose and was startled when a burning pain suddenly hit his upper back. The tattooed giant had moved behind Reynolds unnoticed and slapped him on the back with a hand the size of a shovel. "Another one? Double," Reynolds grunted, hoping the bartender wouldn't fulfill the request. A wide grin spread across the face of the giant who had moved next to Reynolds, revealing teeth the size of sugar cubes. Jeffrey had to look up when he turned to face the man. The giant was almost a foot taller than Jeffrey. The ape-man stared into Reynolds' eyes, trying to discern what kind of man he was. Jeffrey didn't look away. His mouth, esophagus, and stomach burned. Later, his rectum would burn too, Jeffrey speculated, but he didn't want to worry about that yet. The giant had formed his opinion. "You seem like a good guy, soldier boy. Grab a beer and come sit at the table. It's nice to have some new company." Reynolds gladly left the counter, as this meant he would likely avoid another chili shot. The giant man lumbered back to his throne at the end of the room and plopped his massive rear into the brown leather armchair. Reynolds sat on the black sofa next to it. "So, who are you really, dressed in camouflage and all?" Reynolds cursed inwardly, wishing he had come up with a cover story. "Steve," he blurted out. "Steve Hill." Reynolds had no idea why his former colleague's name came to mind first, but it would have to do. The tattooed giant stared for a moment. "Steve, huh? Hard to believe. You don't look like a Steve at all." Reynolds almost panicked before realizing the giant was joking. He said nothing. "Well, Steve it is," the man said, slapping his large hands on his thighs and bursting into laughter. Reynolds forced a smile. The man stopped laughing. "No, seriously though, I'm Steve Stryker, but people call me Juggernaut." He extended his shovel-sized hand toward Reynolds, who grabbed it and shook firmly. "Soldier Steve," he introduced himself. The giant burst into laughter again. "You're a funny guy. Soldier Steve, huh? Couldn't have come up with a better name myself. You've probably heard of me, but don't believe everything you hear. That last story in Alibi magazine was complete bullshit. I've never messed with any animals. They claimed I was selling steroids to pigs. Like, what the fuck? Maybe the pigs are bulking up, but they're not hitting the gym, are they? Or do they have personal trainers too?" Jeffrey didn't know what to say, so he remained silent. "Let's have some beer," Stryker continued, whistling through his teeth to get the bartender's attention. He then raised 2 fingers and pointed at the table. Soon, the bartender brought over 2 large pints. Reynolds was pleased to also receive a glass of milk. He immediately began drinking it to alleviate the burning sensation still raging inside him. "Do you have a bike?" Stryker inquired. "A bike?" Jeffrey asked, confused, wiping his milk mustache with his sleeve. "Yeah, a motorcycle, you know." "No, I don't, but I have a retro Sierra, a white rally car that sounds just as good as your bikes. It even has a spoiler and everything." Right. What do you do for a living, soldier?" "I'm a small business owner." "What's that, a small dick entrepreneur?" Stryker burst into laughter. "No, it means small and medium-sized," Reynolds explained. "Ah, I see." Stryker's expression became serious. "So, which one are you? Do you have a small or medium-sized dick?" The man burst into raucous laughter again, tears streaming down his face as he tried to stifle it. "Guess that makes me a large entrepreneur," Stryker continued, laughing loudly once more. Someone at a nearby table spit out their beer upon hearing the joke. Jeffrey smiled politely. "If I tell him I'm a truck driver, I'll get penis jokes," Reynolds thought. On the other hand, he could make fun of Stryker's extended front fork on his bike. Now that was a real phallic extension. He decided to change the subject. As the evening progressed, the giant drank an astonishing amount of alcohol and started behaving accordingly. Stryker's speech slurred, and he repeated the same stories over and over. Reynolds drank as little as possible without raising suspicion. Whenever he went to the bathroom, he took his beer with him and poured it down the drain. It felt wrong, a real waste of alcohol. At some point, a skinny motorcyclist arrived at the bar. His bare elbows were marked with red scars and bruises from needle use. His greasy brown hair was a tangled mess. His pale blue eyes were sunken, and sparse stubble dotted his gaunt cheeks. He had only a few teeth left. His clothes hung loosely on his emaciated frame. The guy probably didn't weigh even 130 pounds. Reynolds had noticed him glancing occasionally in his and Stryker's direction with an unfriendly look. Not that his face could likely ever appear friendly. Reynolds had been listening to the giant's endless stories for several hours. He hadn't managed to bring up the issue of weapons. Getting a word in edgewise was nearly impossible, but now the host was nearing a state of unconsciousness. Reynolds decided it was time to act. "You must have some firepower here for protection against rival gangs or the militia," he tried steering the conversation. Stryker ignored the question and continued his rambling. "You should come to our Eastern Finland chapter's cabin for a drink sometime. There's a sauna, a lake, and everything, the giant slurred, searching for words. Reynolds tried again. Yeah, sounds great. So do you have any weapons here? I could use one. Stryker ignored the question again. From the shore you can catch 6 feet pike just by dipping your finger in the water. I wouldn't go swimming with my balls exposed. The giant chuckled, but his eyes were already closing. Unless you want a mouthful of pike. But those teeth. The giant's voice trailed off and his chin dropped to his chest. He was out. Reynolds rubbed his face. He stared at Stryker for a moment and tried shaking his shoulder. The man didn't react. God damn it, this is just what we needed, Reynolds cursed. He took his pint and drank slowly, watching the other gang members over the rim of his glass. The skinny guy at the bar stood up and walked over. Reynolds set his glass down. I might have something you need, the junkie began. Reynolds sat quietly. Come outside and we'll make a deal. Reynolds weighed his options. He needed a weapon, and it seemed this junkie might be offering one. He stood up and staggered slightly. Lead the way, Reynolds said, directing the junkie to walk ahead of him. He followed a few steps behind. Reynolds noticed the guy wasn't wearing a leather vest. Maybe he wasn't part of the gang after all. The guy wore a black t-shirt with a large pink hand flipping the bird on the back. Perhaps the junkie had also gotten the VIP shot, Jeffrey thought as he followed the scrawny man. Once outside, Reynolds lit a cigarette. The air felt fresh after being inside for so long. No one else was outside. Everyone had moved indoors to be closer to the alcohol. Reynolds followed the junkie to the side yard on the right side of the building. The space between the building and the chain-link fence surrounding the property was about 15 feet. There were large gray garbage bins along the wall. So, what are you proposing? Reynolds began. The junkie pulled a gun from his waistband. Reynolds' delight at seeing the weapon quickly vanished when the junkie raised it and pointed it at his chest. Shut up, give me all your money, and no one gets hurt, the junkie demanded. The effect of the alcohol seemed to vanish as Reynolds' body flooded with adrenaline. The situation had gone completely to shit in record time. Never trust a junkie, Reynolds chastised himself. Hey, let's take it easy. Can we talk about this? The giant inside probably wouldn't be happy if his new friend got threatened out here with a gun. I don't give a fuck what that giant asshole thinks about my business. Start handing over your cash, or I'll blow a new air hole in your chest. Reynolds stared silently. He had raised his hands. God damn it, he cursed inwardly. Under normal circumstances, an undernourished junkie would be no match. A small gust of wind could probably beat the guy up pretty badly. But the gun shifted the odds in the junkie's favor. The impatient junkie stepped closer and swung the butt of the gun toward Reynolds' left eye. Reynolds raised his arm to block the blow. Most of the force was deflected by his arm, but the butt of the gun scraped his eye painfully. Stars burst before his eyes, and Reynolds felt blood start to flow from the corner. He wiped at the wound and looked at his hand. Blood was pouring out. The junkie stepped back and pointed the gun again. Money or you'll get more, he ordered. Okay, take it easy. Reynolds tried to buy some time, hoping one of the gang members would come outside and interrupt the junkie. I don't have much money, Jeffrey said, feeling the weight of his wallet in his inside pocket. Then he noticed a piece of wood, over 3 feet long, lying on the ground. It had been left there from a dismantled pallet. Keeping his eyes fixed on the junkies, he saw the junkie's head twitching to the side, likely from the drugs or the lack thereof. Okay, Reynolds said in a calming tone. I'm going to get my wallet from my thigh pocket. The junkie nodded. Okay, but make it quick, the junkie said, waving the gun at Jeffrey. Reynolds bent slightly and tore open the Velcro-sealed pocket. Then he quickly sidestepped and grabbed the piece of wood from the ground. With a swift motion, he swung it towards the junkie's head. The junkie managed to step back, avoiding a direct hit to the head, but the wood struck the junkie's outstretched hand, causing the gun to fly out of his grasp. The junkie yelped and clutched his injured hand to his chest. Reynolds lost his balance and fell sideways to the ground. Recovering from the surprise, the junkie kicked Reynolds in the stomach. The blow knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping for air. The next kick was aimed at his ribs. Reynolds' arms pulled up to shield himself, absorbed some of the impact, but they now throbbed with pain as well. The junkie was furious, pacing around Reynolds, looking for the gun, but he couldn't seem to find it. The junkie cursed nonstop. The next kick landed on Reynolds' groin. The pain was indescribable. Reynolds groaned, tears streaming from his eyes. He thought he'd rather drink another chili cocktail than take a kick to the balls. The nerve signals from his groin overwhelmed his brain, and his ears started ringing. The ringing turned into a wavering sound. His head spun. Through squinted eyes, he saw the junkie spinning around, searching for something. The ringing in his ears grew louder and clearer. An ambulance, Jeffrey thought. Someone must have seen the situation and his bloody head and called for an ambulance. No, no one had called an ambulance for him. It wouldn't have arrived that quickly. It had to be the police. In excruciating pain, he managed to get on his knees and drew in as much air as he could. His side hurt, but it was nothing compared to the pain in his groin. He vomited without warning, still on all fours. The junkie seemed to have recognized the approaching vehicle as a police car. The junkie's footsteps echoed off the surrounding buildings as he ran away. Reynolds spat out the vomit and wiped his mouth with his jacket sleeve. He lifted his head and couldn't believe his eyes. His left eye stung, and his vision was blurry from the blood. He wiped his eye and tried to focus. Under the trash bin against the wall was the junkie's gun. The junkie hadn't found his weapon and hadn't dared to stay once he heard the police sirens. Now the siren was very close. Reynolds crawled over his vomit towards the trash bin. The asphalt was hard and rough under his hands and knees, but Jeffrey didn't care. He reached for the gun and stood up, using the trash bin for support. He peered towards the front yard, gun in hand. The music still thumped inside, apparently masking the sound of the approaching sirens, as no one inside seemed to have reacted. Or maybe the gang members were so used to police visits that they didn't care. But the junkie was nowhere in sight. Reynolds stuffed the gun into his jacket pocket and looked around. If he went to the front yard, he might run straight into the police and it would all be over. He looked at the chain-link fence to his left. It was at least 8 feet high. Climbing it with his battered body would be painful. He leaned against the trash bin, which rolled and bumped against the building wall. He took a step back from the bin. Of course, it had wheels. Jeffrey grabbed the edge of the trash bin and started pushing it towards the fence. The police would be here any moment. Halfway there, the bin suddenly stopped. Reynolds took a better grip and pushed again. The wheels nearest to him lifted off the ground, and the bin almost tipped over. Something was blocking the wheels. Jeffrey limped to the other side of the bin and saw what had stopped it. It was the same piece of wood he had used to knock the gun from the junkie's hand. He removed the wood from the wheel's path. Bending over sent a sharp pain through his side, making him almost lose his balance. He crouched back to the other side of the bin. The siren was close now. The police would be in the yard any second. Jeffrey pushed the bin with his shoulder. It hit the fence with a clang like a cymbal. Reynolds climbed laboriously onto the bin. It threatened to roll out from under his feet as he heaved himself onto the fence. He clambered over the top, but as he dropped down, something snagged on the fence. There was a ripping sound, and Reynolds landed awkwardly on the muddy ground dotted with clumps of grass. His right ankle took all the weight and twisted painfully. He heard a car screech into the yard, tires squealing and sirens blaring. He pulled himself towards the fence, using his hands. The trash bin remained on the other side, providing some cover. Now his ankle throbbed with pain. Jeffrey panted heavily. He pulled his legs up to better hide himself. His right ankle started to swell immediately. His boot felt tighter around his ankle. Maybe it would prevent the worst swelling and act like compression bandage. Reynolds tried to calm his breathing. The sirens stopped wailing. Flickering blue and red lights alternated in the dimming evening. Car doors opened, followed by the sound of footsteps and then rapid discussion. Reynolds couldn't make out the words over the blaring music. He just sat and waited. Running wasn't an option. The chain-link fence offered no cover, and with a twisted ankle, he couldn't move quickly. So he waited. After a moment, the music stopped. Loud shouting came from inside. Reynolds thought he recognized one of the voices as Stryker's. It was usually a low growl, but now it was a loud roar, yet the tone was unmistakable. As the door opened, the voices became clearer. Jeffrey listened to the exchange. "By what damn right do you barge in here? Do you even have a search warrant? You're not taking me to the station," Stryker drunkenly yelled. "We wouldn't be taking you anywhere if you hadn't attacked Anderson. Now you can cool off for a bit." Next, there were grunts as two police officers tried to shove the large man into the back seat of the Mondeo. "Try to fit in there, or you'll ride in the trunk," one of the officers threatened. After a moment, a door slammed. Stryker was secured in the back seat. "Wait a minute," one officer said. Footsteps approached Reynolds. He stiffened and held his breath, pulling his legs closer to his body. The footsteps stopped very close. Jeffrey didn't dare to turn and look. His camouflage suit blended well with the surroundings. The police officer couldn't be more than 3 feet away. Reynolds waited. What is he going to do? The next sound surprised him. He heard the zip of a fly and then the sound of urine splashing against the chain-link fence. Reynolds was so close that he couldn't avoid the splatter. He turned his face away, but droplets scattered everywhere as the urine hit the fence. After what seemed like an eternity, the stream weakened and ended with a shake. The zipper was pulled up, and the footsteps receded. "You should cut down on those energy drinks," one officer shouted. "Don't lecture me, Hasselhoff, and I won't comment on your driving." The footsteps stopped again. "Come take a look here. There's fresh blood." Reynolds heard the other officer approach the side of the building. "Damn right there is, and looks like some vomit too. What do you think happened here? Should we search the area more thoroughly? We might find a body in one of these barrels." Jeffrey tensed at the mention of a more thorough search. "Burning bodies? Out here?" "Calm down, big guy. We'll question Stryker at the station. It might just be menstrual blood," Hasselhoff speculated. The officers walked back to the car, and Reynolds exhaled. The Mondeo started and reversed out of the yard, with a few gang members watching the scene and shouting insults after the police. Classic taunts like "fucking pigs" and "jerk-off cops" were among them. Moments after the shouts died down, the music started up again inside. The song was Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run. Reynolds hauled himself up, using the fence for support. "No running today," Jeffrey said, testing his weight on the foot. It didn't hurt as much as he expected. Maybe it was just a mild sprain. He began to walk along the fence, using it for support. Jeffrey made his way towards his office, glancing over his shoulder occasionally. No one seemed to be following him. Blood still trickled from the cut at the corner of his eye, and every step sent a burst of pain through his groin, with his right ankle throbbing every other step. What had initially been a 5-minute walk now took 20. When Reynolds finally reached his destination, he checked to ensure he wasn't being followed. Seeing no one, he fumbled for his keys and unlocked the door. He slipped inside and locked the door behind him. Limping to his desk, he sat down gingerly. He pulled the gun from his jacket pocket and placed it on the desk. Getting the gun hadn't gone as planned, but the outcome was satisfactory, and he hadn't spent a dime. The gun was a black Beretta 92F. Reynolds examined it, turning it in his hands, careful not to point it at himself. He located what he thought was the safety. Then he startled himself, somehow managing to release the magazine, which clattered onto the desk. He needed to be careful not to get himself killed. He picked up the magazine and inspected it. There were bullets inside. He had no intention of shooting anyone, but a few warning shots might be necessary. Reynolds slid the magazine back into place and set the gun in front of him. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey. He flicked the cap aside and took a swig, grimacing. The difference between good and bad whiskey was marginal. His eye and ankle throbbed, and his groin and side ached. Reynolds slowly stood up. He needed to pee. There was a small bathroom in the office. The floor space was barely 10 square feet. When you sat on the toilet, the door would hit your knees. Reynolds carefully urinated. At least there was no blood in his urine. He gingerly felt his testicles. Something down there was swollen, and not in a good way, Jeffrey concluded as he carefully pulled up his pants. He felt his right ribs, opened his jacket, and lifted his shirt. Raising his arm caused a sharp pain in the spot where he had been kicked. There was a reddish area on his side, with a dark blue center. Taking a deep breath was painful. Next, he examined his face. Blood had dripped from the corner of his eye onto his jacket. His face was half covered in blood. The jacket now had a big dark stain, which didn't stand out much from the original camouflage pattern. Reynolds yanked some toilet paper from the holder. He wet it under the tap and began to wipe the blood from his face. The bleeding from the wound had started to stop, but the surrounding area was swollen and red. After cleaning his face and the area around the wound, Reynolds took another piece of paper and pressed it gently against the cut. He walked back to his desk and sat down again. Hopefully, those cops caught that junkie. He must have heard when I was trying to ask about a gun and figured I had money. Reynolds winced as a sharp pain shot through his groin. Damn bastard. Reynolds opened the top drawer and took out a blister pack of 400 milligrams ibuprofen. He snapped off 3 tablets and washed them down with whiskey. Reynolds put his hands on the desk and rested his head on his arms, with the uninjured eye downward. In 2 minutes, he fell into a restless sleep. At the police station, a large man sat in interrogation room 2. His butt and thighs overflowed the edges of the metal chair bolted to the floor. His knees nearly touched the underside of the table in front of him. His wrists were cuffed, with the chain running through a metal loop attached to the table. Hasselhoff entered, followed by Anderson. "Well, Stryker, we meet again. We have a situation where all the cells are full. Some sort of crime wave, apparently, so you get the interrogation room. You might as well tell us what happened at the clubhouse. Someone managed to escape the scene, though our boys and a dog are on their trail, but who knows how that will turn out. And there was fresh blood on the ground," Hasselhoff narrated. "I don't know. I was passed out when you barged in. Can I get a glass of water? My throat is dry even though I've been drinking all evening." Stryker let out something like a laugh. Hasselhoff wasn't amused by the old joke. "Anderson, go get a glass of water." Anderson left, and Hasselhoff waited until his partner returned. Stryker got a glass of water placed in front of him. He grabbed it with both hands, handcuffs and all. The glass was empty in a moment. "If I tell you what I know, can I get the hell out of here?" "Of course, like I said, we're a bit overbooked, and the best rooms are in high demand," Hasselhoff quipped. In the background, Anderson was ready with a notepad. "Some army weirdo came to the clubhouse. I haven't seen him before. He said his name was Steve Hill. I remember because I made a joke about it." "Another Steve, huh? You're not just bullshitting me, are you? What did this Steve want?" Hasselhoff made air quotes with his fingers. "I don't know. Maybe he wanted drinking company. He didn't talk much, though I probably didn't give him a chance to speak. But when I asked if he had a bike, he said he had a white Sierra with a huge spoiler and a damn loud engine." Hasselhoff glanced at Anderson. "You hear that? The same guy again." Anderson nodded. "Describe what he looked like." "Head to toe in camouflage, in his 50s. Could be younger." "You mean camouflage clothing?" Hasselhoff asked. "Yeah. Tall, short, skinny, fat? What color eyes? What about his hair? Would you sleep with him?" "Go to hell, Hasselhoff," Stryker said, but continued. "I don't know, everyone looks pretty small from my perspective. Just an average guy." "Hey, Anderson, write down that he's an average middle-aged man, and that Stryker wouldn't sleep with him unless it was an emergency," Stryker instructed. Anderson stared for a moment, then began writing. Hasselhoff stepped over to Stryker and unlocked the handcuffs. "You can find your way out. Should we call a cab, or will you find your own ride?" Stryker just grunted and headed towards the door. "Goodbye," Hasselhoff called out. "No, goodbye for good. Stryker shouted back.